Good evening. It's good to have you here tonight. I think somebody broke the weather. We were enjoying nice, cool, pleasant weather, and now it's 80 degrees and humid out there. Oh, horrible. This is January still. Oh well, we'll survive. I tell you what, as far as announcements go, last Sunday is one of those Sundays where there's so many things to talk about until you get to that Sunday that when it's over, it's like, wait, there's nothing left. There's no announcements left. It was a busy Sunday. Last week was very busy, so I appreciate everyone and your participation and attitude of endurance through the whole thing. It was a long day of ministry. But the things looking ahead as we kind of work our way into February here pretty quickly, we did start the Pilgrim's Progress Bible study, or not Bible study, book study. You'll feel at times like you're just studying the Bible because there's so much of it in there. But that began last Sunday, and good turnout so far for that. So it is not too late if you decide you want to jump in there and come. Not too late to join in, so just show up, I guess would be the best way to do it. If you're here tonight and you want to show up on Sunday, let me know, and I think we can have a book ready for you by the time you get there. But not really too far into, well, we're just about to get into the story this coming Sunday night. So if you want to join in, please do, let me know. It is, yes, it's the Modern English. Absolutely, yeah. So, well, I guess it depends on if you try to bring in a different book, then yeah, you can have whatever English version you want. There's a few different ones, but yeah, the one that we're trying to get everybody to use as a Modern English version. And I thought it was actually funny, there's a part of the book, it's called The Author's Apology, and he explains why he wrote the book, and he actually explained why he didn't, or that, I know there's not a lot of, pictures or visual, well, the version we have, somebody went along and they had added, there's about 100 illustrations, hand-drawn illustrations that had been added to the book at some point. So, but our goal for that study is to kind of get through, look at the Christian life and how that's explained to us, some great truths to pick up there, but also a lot of discussion. That's going to be the key. That's going to be what we're trying to do the most of during the class time, is discuss some of these characters and some of these places, how that applies with the Christian life, and how it really challenges us in our own walk and in our own spiritual growth. So that is going on. Coming up in February, a couple things. Well, one thing is we're going to be starting a men's Saturday morning once a month, a Saturday morning breakfast, Bible study, prayer, that sort of thing. Mark Burritt is going to be leading that. So that will be February the 17th, which is the third Saturday of February. And that'll be at 7:30 a.m. So we'll start off early, but we'll have coffee and breakfast. So it'll be great. So for the men, I encourage you to be a part of that. The ladies have their monthly meeting along with the Tuesday Bible studies and such, but we're going to get a men's one going here, hopefully. So that'll be coming up here pretty soon. Let's go ahead and we'll open with a word of prayer tonight. Lord, as we come to you, we are grateful for your word and the truth that it has for us. Lord, I ask that tonight as we look at the impact that the gospel makes, the way that it changes people, the way that it changes, Lord, well, I hope that we would live it out in a way that changes our culture in the world around us, that has just enough of an impact that it is noticeably different. Lord, so help us as we strive to do that in Jesus' name. Amen. Acts chapter 19 is where we are. Ephesus is where Paul is as we look to this chapter. Good, lengthy ministry in the city of Ephesus. We talked a little bit more about that last week. Lots of time, a couple of years worth of ministry in Ephesus, which, eventually, as we look into the future, Paul will write to Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Timothy is the pastor, the one who's set as pastor of the church in Ephesus. So he gets to carry on the work that Paul was doing there. Of course, Timothy is with Paul as he's ministering. We see that. But Ephesus was an important city. It was a key place that we actually have great information about. I've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again just in case you didn't hear it or you were ignoring me at that time. It's fine. Times I need to ignore myself, so don't worry about it. But these places that Paul visits in the book of Acts, when we have a letter to those churches, man, what a great supplement to help us understand a little bit, more of the story. We see a little bit, maybe an event or two in some of these places, like Corinth or in Ephesus, or even Philippi, Thessalonica, but to open up the book of Thessalonians, right? To open up the book of Philippians, we get insight into the church and what things they're dealing with, the challenges of the church, and of course, Paul's love and his concern for the churches, which is an awesome thing to see as well. As we look tonight, we're going to see pretty much the end of Paul's ministry in Ephesus, kind of how things wrap up, which usually every time his ministry in a city ends, it's because of some kind of uprising. It's somebody trying to plot against him and harm him, and so that's what happens. Here we're going to see a riot actually takes place in the city of Ephesus. This is not the first city that has had a riot on Paul and the Gospels account, but this one ends, God takes care of it, of course, but we'll see how God uses that. Look with me at verse 21 of Acts chapter 19. We'll read through these events that take place. It says, "Now after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, 'After I've been there, I must also see Rome.'" So Paul's long-term planning is Rome. That's on the list of places to go. "Having sent into Macedonia two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while." So as we said, Timothy was already with Paul in the city of Ephesus, ministering with him, but Paul sends these two away. "About that time there arose no little disturbance according to the way, or concerning the way, for a man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen in similar trades and said, 'Men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. There's a danger not only that this trade of ours may come to disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship." A super powerful God when just because somebody ignores her or doesn't worship her, she is going to be deposed or brought down low. Anyway, when they heard this, they were enraged and were crying out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" So the city was filled with the confusion, and they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. When Paul wished to go in among the crowd, the disciples would not let him, and even some of the Asiarchs, those from Asia, I'm guessing, who were friends of his, sent to him and were urging him not to venture into the theater. Now some cried out one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know that they had come, or why they had come together. Some of the crowd prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward, and Alexander, motioning with his hand, wanted to make a defense to the crowd. But when they recognized he was a Jew, for about 2 hours, they all cried out with one voice, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." When the town clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, "Men of Ephesus, who is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple keeper to the great Artemis and of the sacred stone that fell from the sky? Seeing then that these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. For you've brought these men here who are neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our goddess. If therefore Demetrius and the craftsmen with him have complained against anyone, the courts are open. There are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you seek anything further, it should be settled in the regular assembly. For we really are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there's no cause that we can give to justify this commotion." When he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly. We'll stop there. Again, from here, Paul pretty well takes off. It ends his time in the city of Ephesus. But as we look tonight, we want to look at what happens when the gospel changes people. When people begin to be changed by the gospel, what really happens is it affects the world around them. The evidence of true change from the gospel is when the world around is affected by that change. So as we look tonight, how does gospel change affect the world around us? What impact does it have? And we'll see some examples here that we can also look to and maybe, if you will, expect as we look at how gospel change affects the world around us. One of the first things that we see here is we see that when the gospel changes us, not everyone will be happy. Not everyone will be happy. Remember, at this point, it's been a couple years that Paul has been in Ephesus. Some of the issues that this man Demetrius is going to bring up are the kind of issues that you would only know after a period of time, right? How's he going to know if it's affecting his business? Well, it doesn't affect his business the day that Paul shows up on the scene. Or a few weeks after, maybe people are getting saved and Paul is sharing the gospel. It's over the course of these couple years, and as the gospel spreads and people's lives are being changed, Demetrius looks around and he says, wait just a second here, there's a problem. Anybody in business, when your revenue stream starts to dry up, you got to start asking those questions like, why, right? What's the cause of this? What's going on? A lot of businesses will have a kind of a low period through the year, right? Where things kind of die out a little bit, and then there'll be other times. We were just not too long ago. We were up in Georgia, St. Simon's Island, and it's a real not touristy place, but it's a beach type community. It's an island community, so summers are huge, right? Summers are big. That's where a lot of these businesses are making most of their money. The time that we were there, the first couple weeks of January, crickets were chirping, and that's the way that we like it. So we had a good time. Not a lot of people there. But you ask those questions as a business owner, where's the money? Why are we not making the revenue? And Demetrius is sitting there saying, man, what is it that's causing this problem? And he finds an answer. The answer is Paul. The answer is, well, this way, right? That's what he says. There was no little disturbance concerning the way, right? Speaking of Jesus, Demetrius is a silversmith. He kind of makes his money crafting these things. It says that he makes shrines of Artemis. In other words, the same word for shrine is the word temple. So you might think mini temple. If some of these countries around the world, they have little temples, or even each household in a culture might have a little shrine in there, and in that little shrine, they've got their candles and they've got their little idols, or they got the little trinkets and things that they put in there. So it's kind of a partnership. Demetrius makes these little shrines. And as it says here below, he brought no little business to the craftsmen. The craftsmen would be the ones that make the little idols and the little things that are going to go in the shrine. So it's kind of a teamwork thing, and he builds the shrines, they build the idols, and everybody makes lots and lots of money until Paul comes along, until the way is spoken of, until the gospel begins to change the hearts and the lives of people. Why was he not happy? Well, economic, right? And we would say it's the economic impact of godliness. It's the economic impact of the gospel. People who at one time worshipped idols, worshipped this Artemis, this goddess? Well, when they trust Christ, when they believe the God that Paul talks about, well, that God, according to that God, there are no other gods. And quite honestly, when you know by relationship the God of the Bible, you realize there's not a need for any other gods. There's not room for any other gods. That commandment in the book of Exodus, when God says there shall be no other gods before me, if you read it like we read English today, it sounds like it's saying, well, okay, as long as God's number one, we can have a number 2 and a number 3 and a number 4. No, there's no other gods in my presence. There's no other gods allowed is what that means, because, again, in reality, if God, the God of the Bible, is who he claims to be, and as great and as expansive as he claims to be, there's no room for any other God, little g. And that's what people are discovering in the city of Ephesus. And when they realize that these little idols don't do anything, when they realize that it's just false worship, they're just the creation and the craft of men's hands, they say, well, why waste my money, right? And they're not going to the temple of Artemis with their money to worship and to give as they used to. And so the change of heart turns into a change of behavior, a change in worship. And for the city of Ephesus, it's having an economic impact. Paul's message clearly opposed. I mean, that's what the complaint is from Demetrius, right? Let's see. He says that Paul, verse 26, you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying gods made with hands are not gods. They're false, right? Paul says, here's the one true God, and here's the way, or his son Jesus that he sent to pay for sin. And so Paul's message is turning people away. And the concern here, now he says, it's funny how he words this, right? Verse 27, now, not only is there a danger to our trade, which I think was probably his main concern, right? You want to mess with people, mess with their money. And he says, well, it's not just about our trade. He says that this trade of ours will come into disrepute. Okay? In other words, we get a bad reputation if everybody's starting to believe that these gods and these idols are false and they're not real and they're, then these guys who are making them are going to have a bad reputation, because people will say, well, if you're making these, you're just trying to make money. You're just trying to take advantage of us, right? So they'll have a bad reputation. But he says, in addition to that, he says, we also have to be concerned about the temple of the great goddess Artemis that is being considered as nothing. If people are not going to worship these gods, then she's going to be offended, maybe, right? Nobody's paying attention to her. Yes?
What's the purpose of the actual idol? Are they worshiping it, or are they worshiping some make-believe god that isn't that thing made with?
Sure. So he mentioned the rock, right? The stone. Who is it? The town clerk mentions that later in the account, right? So there was apparently, whether it was a meteorite or something else, that there was a unique stone that they say looked like or gave the appearance of a woman, which is why this is a female god. And I think they had done a little bit of cosmetic work to it also. If you want to read descriptions about Artemis, you can. But these little idols that they would have in their own little shrine would almost be like a good luck charm connected to type of thing. They always had to go to the temple of Artemis to worship. There were regular, I was going to mention a little bit later here, there's many believe that this is taking place during what they call the Festival of Artemis. It's about a month-long celebration where I hate to even make the comparison, but similar to maybe like the Passover, where all the Jews would come to worship in Jerusalem during the festival of Artemis, all the people from the surrounding areas that worship Artemis would come and convene for a month in Ephesus to worship at this temple. And it was a pretty raunchy...
That sentence, gods made with hands are not gods, makes it sound like they're actually worshiping the thing.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, as though it is that God, yes. Yeah, I mean, they didn't worship it even as a representation. Yeah. So, well, like I said, for us, we're looking at that and saying it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Yeah. I think it was, I'd love to say it was in Isaiah, but one of the prophets of the Old Testament made the connection and basically said to Israel, like, hey, here's the problem, is he says, you're taking this chunk of wood, for example. He said, one part of it, you're fashioning it into some type of an idol, and you're worshiping it. Another section of it, you're putting underneath your pot to kindle and cook your food. And then the rest of it, you're using to have a fire to keep you warm. And the idea is like, hey, this doesn't make any sense, right? How can all three of those come from the same, something worth worshiping? How can it come from wood? But again, that's the deception, I guess, of the idolatry. But what's happening, again, the concern that, they're not going to be worshiping her, and she may even be deposed from her magnificence. The sense there is like, we have elevated her to this great high position, and if Paul has his way, she's going to be lowered, right? And as I said earlier, what kind of a God is that? What power does that God have if, depending on how many people worship her, or whether or not I worship her, she's either great or she's not great? Doesn't make any sense. But that's their rationale. I think about this and the concern that they have over their businesses, right? Because of these preachers, right? Because of Paul preaching about the way, because so many people are following the way, so many people's lives are changing, we're losing our businesses. And I just kind of tried to think about, in our culture today, what if people were being saved and turning from sin, in numbers maybe, as we're seeing here, what industries, what businesses in our culture would begin to struggle, right? I would say, are you raising your hand? Okay, sorry. I would say also, if believers were turning from sin in such a way that was noticeable, if we were separating ourselves from those things in such a way, what businesses would take notice, right? What organizations would begin to lose revenue? And I think the simplest is when we talk about our viewing habits, maybe, right? If Christians stop going to objectionable movies, or renting them at home, or watching them on streaming services, right? If they stopped, if believers, I'm just saying Christians, believers. But of course, in your house, nobody knows, right? So maybe we think, again, nobody knows. But it's also a way that as believers, we're not impacting the world that we're in. We say we want to impact the world, and maybe sometimes all we think is that the only way that we do that is by telling people about Jesus and hoping they get saved. It's more than that. It's when that gospel that we believe begins to change us. When it changes not only our spiritual destiny or destination, where we're no longer a child of Satan, we're now a child of God, and our destination is no longer hell, but it's heaven. But when it begins to change our day-to-day lives, when our faith begins to change the things that we do, and the things that we say, and the things that we watch, and the things that we participate in, and even the ways that we spend our resources, that's where the world around us is probably going to take the most notice. But don't think that there's, well, if we do this and the world takes notice, we'll start a great revolution. No. Remember, nobody liked what was going on here, right? There was a problem with this. Just because good things are happening and the gospel is changing people, don't expect that everybody's going to be happy about it, right? And that's what we're seeing here. When the gospel changes people, not everyone is going to be happy. When people aren't pursuing evil, okay? When people stop participating in evil, it begins to ruin the reputation of those who are doing the wrong thing. I'll just give you one of the most obvious examples, I think, in this area. If such a transformation took place in the people of this community, that no one was interested in attending some of these gentlemen's clubs, right? What would happen is that those who were doing that, since they're a decreasing number, there would be a more negative, if you will, reputation that those individuals, like whoever's going to keep doing this and participating in this, and they're going to have a worse reputation. But because there's such a large number of people participating, and because it's basically almost assumed that this is what people are going to participate in, and it's just become a part of our culture, and especially the culture around here, it doesn't ruin the reputation for a person to walk through the doors of one of those establishments. What if, because of the gospel changing people in a community, the change was so dramatic that businesses like that started losing business? I wonder if we've become so comfortable with some of these places, some of these just out there and in the open sin establishments. I wonder if we become so comfortable with those things that we don't even try to think about how we might turn the tide, about how we might impact a place like that to see change. Not everyone is happy when the gospel is changing people. Don't expect that just because your life is changing and you're making right decisions that honor and please God, that the people around you are going to be happy with that. It doesn't always work that way. Second thing that we see here in this passage is that the world is often confused. When the gospel begins to change people, the world is often confused. When the gospel changes people, the world is often confused. Twice in this little passage, or this little section, this paragraph, twice that word confusion is used. It's described a couple of different times, but let's think about this. I mean, why was there this confusion? Well, there was a mob, right? It was a riot. It was this mob mentality. Not the first rodeo, if you will, for Paul. The protest began against Paul. You know, the statement was made, hey, these guys are ruining everything. And then in verse 26 or 28, the chant, right? Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. So it begins with lots of noise. There's lots of chanting. This is a situation, let's just say there's just too many people standing around doing nothing. That's a condition. The last place that the riot happened, or a mob was stirred up, there's a phrase, I have to give you the King James phrase because it's better, that the ones that were stirred to action or stirred up against Paul and his companions, they're referred to in the King James as lewd men of the baser sort. In other words, guys that don't have a great reputation, guys that were sitting around being lazy, they weren't doing anything, and they were easily stirred into a riot and into a protest, if you will, And that's what's happening here. As I mentioned earlier with Jeff's question, many believe that it was maybe during the festival of Artemis or this celebration, this month-long celebration. And so there would have been tons of people from all over that had filtered in and funneled into the city. So lots of people that were there for really nothing more than to do kind of a couple things. Number one, intoxication was at the top of the list. Well, maybe second on the list. The other thing was fornication. Those were the two things that were at the top of the list for this particular celebration, and it was expected that everybody would participate. So you have a lot of people that are sitting around fully intoxicated. One description that was given of an ancient historian about this was that as you would walk through the city, everyone you saw was intoxicated. It's just the way that it was for the entire month of this quote-unquote celebration. Paul's got a couple of companions that get caught up in this, Gaius and Aristarchus. They get kind of dragged into the amphitheater there, if you will. Paul tries to help, but he's stopped. His companions, the other disciples, it says, hey, listen, don't do this. Don't go in there. Don't get yourself involved. But here's the thing. If you look at verse 32, they really don't have any sense of what they are there for. It says in verse 32, some cried out one thing, some cried out another, and the assembly was in confusion. They don't even know what they're there for, right? Again, just imagine, completely intoxicated, and all they're doing is just yelling about stuff. Everybody's got a different problem. Everybody's got a different complaint. No sense of why they're there. It's actually really common in a lot of protesting that we've seen in our country in the last 4 or 5 years. You get some of these protests going, and then the news reporter goes into these protests and starts talking to people, and every person they ask has a different reason that they're there to protest. Doesn't usually have to do with the reason that it started, but this person said, I'm here for this, I'm protesting for this, and I'm protesting for that. Everybody's got a different reason. It's confusion. And quite honestly, what ends up happening in a lot of those is that people, even within that protest, because you're not protesting the right thing is that I'm protesting, and because I'm protesting, hey, we don't like each other either, so they start to beat each other up. It's confusion, and that's what's happening here. It's funny, they tried to have a spokesperson, this guy Alexander, and he tries to stand up, and he begins to quiet the crowd, and as soon as the crowd finds out he's a Jew, they're like, yeah, we don't like you either. That didn't go anywhere, right? So they just can't get it together. They can't figure out anything. Of course, as a Jew, he wanted to oppose Paul and the message of the way and that sort of thing, but they just couldn't get it together. In all the confusion, though, it seems that the followers of the way, it seems that the believers are pretty calm. We don't see, Gaius isn't fighting, at least not that we see. Aristarchus isn't fighting. Paul was trying to get in there so he could have some kind of a say or some kind of an influence, but even he, rather, it seems, calmly allowed for the believers to say, no, don't go in there. And they're just kind of letting things ride out. I guess I put it this way, on God's side, there's no confusion. This crowd's confused as can be. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're there for. They don't know what they're protesting. They don't know who they're angry at necessarily. But on God's side of it, Aristarchus and Gaius, they know exactly why they're being dragged into the theater, right? Well, because they're followers of the way, right? We're suffering for Christ. Paul knows exactly why. Well, why he can't go in there. The believers that are holding Paul back, they know why they're holding him back because, no confusion on God's side. There's this phrase that is in our culture. It's called, it's the cancel culture, right? That's kind of one of the big ones right now. The approach of the cancel culture is that we have to stop these people that we don't like, right? We have to stop these people that we don't like, and it doesn't matter how, and it doesn't matter at what cost. We just have to stop them. And that's seems the mentality of this mob. We just have to stop these people. And as I mentioned earlier, it usually starts with one thing, then something else piggybacks on top of that, and something else piggybacks on top of that, and then another thing on top of that. And just an example is, the Black Lives Matter protests that seem to be the issue that they began with, but how many other things have been dragged in and lumped on and mixed in together with just that idea of a protest to the point where, again, nobody in there has any idea what they're protesting. They're certainly not all protesting the same thing. But when we look at protests that are trying to push for evil agendas, they still exist today. There's protests for abortion. There's protests to promote homosexuality and all sorts of other fornication. These protests are out there. There's a lot of people doing a lot of shouting, and you hear this chanting. It says in verse 34 that for 2 hours, can you imagine hearing for 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians"? When we're in the car and our kids sing a song that repeats more than like 3 times, it's over. It's done. And then when they start the next one, it's done. And then there's like, okay, for the next 5 minutes, you're not saying anything. You just need to be quiet. Repetition drives you crazy. But if you've watched the protests in our country, that's all it is. It's repetition. It's people shouting things that, quite honestly, some of them don't really know what they're talking about. But that's all that they do for 2 hours. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. In an effort to oppose Christianity at all cost, that's what's happening in America. It's happening around the world, but it's happening in America. Opposing Christianity at all costs, our world has gone for that approach, the confusion approach. Because you can get people to do a lot of crazy things in chaos. When they don't know what's going on, they'll agree to do a lot of crazy things. And the confusion, our country, our culture has begun by confusing the language, changing the meaning of words, where marriage doesn't mean marriage anymore, right? And love doesn't mean love anymore. It means a whole lot of different things. Then they actually remove the meaning of words like toleration, right? Tolerance. Well, they've totally removed the actual meaning of that word, and they've replaced it with a different meaning altogether. Our world has exchanged the clarity of truth for the confusion of relativism. My truth, your truth. Her truth, his truth. Don't argue with my truth, because my truth is my truth. But here's the problem when you exchange truth for relativism, is that eventually your truth is going to step on my truth's toes. And according to relativism, I have the right to beat the daylights out of your truth, because your truth interferes with my truth. And unfortunately, you have the right to beat the daylights out of my truth. You see, it's a vicious thing when there's no truth. In our culture, that's the culture, the country that we live in is relying on this relativism, right? On everybody's got their own truth. And the truth is that everyone doesn't have their own truth. They can claim their own truth, but the truth is that truth is truth. That's it, right? Yes, and the author of truth is God. Basically, if you observe our country, and you could observe even more this year, right? We all know what's going on this year. Elections, all the fun stuff, all the insanity. If you want to see confusion, okay, you want to take an example from. If you want to see confusion, watch this election cycle. You will see an abundance of confusion. Now, I don't want to push one side or the other, because there'll probably be a fair amount of confusion created on both sides. As one person states their truth and the other person states their truth, and exactly, their truth. But as we look at it, just watch. There's going to be confusion. There's going to be chaos. We can bank on that. Why? Because the world is trying to live by their truth, okay? And because ultimately they don't have it. That's the problem. As believers, as followers of Christ, as those who believe that the Word of God is literally the Word of God and that it is true, I would submit to you that the ones who are not going to have confusion, you may be uncertain about, voting for different people, whatever, that's just because people, right? But we should never be uncertain on the truth of what is right, what is wrong, because the truth, we have the truth. So as we watch the world, as we watch our country, in confusion for at least the next year, we don't have to experience that same confusion because we have truth. So as the gospel begins to change people, the world is often confused. Doesn't understand exactly what's going on or what we're doing or, if you will, what makes a follower of Christ tick, right? That's where some of the confusion comes in. The last one here is that as we think about how the gospel, how does the gospel change, affect the world around us, God's people live differently, but not illegally. I would almost offer you a reward if you guessed that one right. That's a fairly random word in the fill-in-the-blank sheets, I'm afraid. We found out on Sunday, if you're not in my Sunday school class, we found out on Sunday that so many are trying to guess the right answers that we might just have to start keeping score. Anyway, God's people live differently, but not illegally. If the world could outlaw righteousness, it would. The world we live in is trying so hard to outlaw righteousness. The simple, easy ones, removing prayer from school, right? Removing Bibles from anywhere they possibly can, removing religious references and monuments from government buildings. The list goes on. If religion and righteousness could be outlawed, the world would do that. But here's the thing, the problem here in Ephesus, the good thing, certainly the good thing for God's people, the problem in Ephesus was not a legal issue, right? It wasn't because they did anything wrong. It was not a legal issue, and so we have the town clerk. How about that? A secular government official comes to the aid of God's people. How often does that happen? Well, it happens every time God wants it to happen. It's happened before, maybe not for Paul necessarily, but God has used pagan rulers, pagan officials to accomplish his work and to preserve his people and to take care of things. So it's not uncommon when we think about how God works, but he comes in and basically he comes in and he quiets the crowd after 2 hours of shouting, "Great is Artemis, God of the Ephesians." After 2 hours of that, he quiets the crowd and he says, "Listen, folks, nothing to see here. Nothing to see here." He says, these people have not done anything. They're not sacrilegious or blasphemers of our goddess. I think that's interesting because in a sense, they clearly were not in favor, right? The Christians, the followers of the way, were obviously not in favor of worshiping Artemis. But they weren't doing anything sacrilegious or blasphemous. There wasn't like this outward vocal opposition that was trying to, if you will, it was trying to shout down the worship of this goddess. Now, that might have been something that would have been grounds for them being arrested, disturbing the peace and whatever it may be. I don't know what all laws they had at that time for those kinds of things, but they weren't doing any of that. And I would suggest to you that they didn't do it because they didn't need to, right? Hey, we're just going to talk about Jesus. We're going to talk about the God who made all things. We're going to talk about Jesus, who is our Savior. We're going to reason with you and explain to you why we believe what we believe. They don't need to sit there and bash, the other God. And I would suggest to you that the longer or the more time we spend as Christians trying to bash the gods of the other religions, now we need to talk about other religions, right? We need to talk about why they're wrong. We need to talk about, the belief systems and understand why their beliefs are wrong so that we understand better why what we understand from the Scripture is right? But we shouldn't be bashing them, if you will. And I would just say that we don't need to do that, right? Most of the time, people aren't won by those kinds of arguments anyway, right? You want to, you do this, or you worship that, or you think that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Well, they're probably not listening to you anymore, right? They did nothing wrong, and so this town clerk says, listen, really says we better disperse right now because there was law against rioting. Right? There was law, I don't know if you would call it, unlawful assembly, or that would be something we would say these days. But there was a law against creating these mobs. And so this guy's like, really, he says in verse 40, we are in danger of being charged with rioting. We're the problem, he says, not them. It's possible, right? It's possible that a person who is a believer can be accused of doing something illegal or something wrong, even if they didn't do something wrong. Years ago, and I think it still is actually an ongoing issue, at least legally, the Christian baker, right, who refused to make a cake and, normal, rational people would say, well, he didn't do anything wrong, right? He decided he didn't want to, but accused of crime, been in the legal process for a long time, the legal battle. So it happens, okay? Don't hear me wrong. It happens. But I believe that as followers of Christ, we should always want to be sure that we're not doing something illegal in order to represent Christ, right? Maybe thinking of doing something that's illegal in order to kind of the dramatic, show of hey, everybody needs to look at Jesus, and so I'm going to do this crazy thing that really I shouldn't be doing, or maybe think of somebody who breaks the law by trespassing in order to get their message across, and those types of things that Christians sometimes may try to do, but we shouldn't be involved in those things. At the same time, there are and there will be a time, not so much right now, but I believe there will be a time when we will have to make the choice between obeying God and obeying government, right? Well, really, most of us are not in that position right now. Our government, does a lot of things that we do not approve of. They approve things that we don't think are right, and they do things that, but we're not necessarily the ones who are participating in that with them. But the example that I always use in this would be along the lines of abortion. Now, interesting that there's been a change, in that. But along the lines of abortion, if the government ever came along and had some type of a mandate, for example, most of you know that in China for a long time it was a one child, and so if it was more than that, there's abortion. It's just if it was mandated, then as believers we'd have a responsibility to say, I'm going to obey God rather than men. If the government comes along like the council did when they brought the disciples in and said, listen, you cannot talk about Jesus of Nazareth anymore. If our government came along and said, you can't talk about Jesus anymore, well, we'd have to say we ought to obey God rather than men. And that doesn't mean that you necessarily walk out of that courtroom and you stand on the steps of the courthouse and you begin to, you could, but we can't, we shouldn't let something like that stop us from doing what God has commanded us to do, right? So the day will come. I believe the day will come, which is why I think that we need to make it a priority that we are already obeying Christ now, while we have the freedom to do that, so that when the freedom is taken away, we will just continue doing what we're doing. That's the Daniel example. When prayer was outlawed, prayer to any other god was outlawed, Daniel didn't wake up and say, oh man, I've never prayed before, but now that it's outlawed, I think I better pray. I want to protest, No. It says that Daniel did exactly what he did every day. Went to the same place, opened the same windows, faced the same direction, and prayed to the same God he prayed to every day, multiple times throughout the day. We need to be in the habit of obeying Christ now, of obeying God's instruction now, so that when that time comes, we're ready to obey. I wonder how many Christians would be accused of doing the wrong thing because they're living righteously today. Now again, I'm not talking about doing something illegal, but how many believers today would live, if you will, such a righteous, God-honoring life that it would be confused for doing the wrong thing? Hey, these people aren't doing any of the things that we're doing. They're not participating in any of these things that we're doing. They're making us feel bad. They're making us look bad. They're, to where somebody would try to make that accusation. My concern, obviously, is that I wonder if we as believers in our country today, in America today, if we don't maybe just enjoy a little bit too much of the world, maybe a little bit so much of the world that we don't really look that different. That the world around us isn't saying, hey, these people are not, they're not playing the same game that we are. They're doing something different. They're living differently, and it's noticeable, and it's, maybe it is affecting our business. Maybe it is affecting our revenue. Maybe it is affecting, I don't know. Are we separate enough from the world? Are we like the believers in Ephesus? Remember last week we talked about, they brought all of their books on witchcraft and all that stuff. They were burning it. They were just getting rid of all of the wicked, sinful things. Are believers today, are we getting rid of all of these sinful things? All of these things that distract us and pull us away from faithfulness to God, are we getting rid of those things to the point where the world around us says, whoa, 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 whoa. What do you think you're doing? You're weird. You're different. You're not living like we are. And it's actually affecting business, right? I mean, what if the believers in Newport Richey lived, if you will, so differently, so uniquely, separated themselves so much from certain aspects of the wickedness of our culture to the point where it began to affect the business of those gentlemen's clubs that we talked about, right? I think nowadays, you see somebody out there protesting outside of one of those places. I see a few from time to time. I think most people drive by, even Christians drive by and say, ooh, weirdo. Unfortunately, they're not a great representation always of Christians. But to those of us who want to represent Christ well, do we have the same desire and passion and want to see sin, the evil, the wickedness removed, done away with in our culture? When the gospel comes in, right? When the gospel changes people, gospel change affects the world around us. That's how we see the genuineness of it, the reality of it, right? How is the world around us changing? I think that would be the question to end on. How is the world around me being changed or impacted noticeably because I'm choosing to push sin aside, get rid of that stuff, not participate anymore, and I'm living differently? As I said before, don't expect the world to like it. Sadly, don't always expect other Christians to like it. but we still need to be changed by the gospel, right? Questions, comments, thoughts? Yes, sir.